What's going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. We have a pretty long set of topics to talk about today, so we're gonna have kind of the the entry kind of intro part relatively short today because I want to make sure we get into the actual topic and get into addressing questions that a bunch of people all of you may have in the chat. So. Like always, if this is your first ever Lumix Live, these are weekly broadcasts that we do every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on a wide variety of different topics, all of which to be a platform for all of you to be able to ask us questions, meet other filmmakers, photographers, creatives out there in the chat, and just be able to create a community where we can all kind of share ideas and have a really good conversation about something that we're all passionate about, photography, videography. And in these streams, these are designed for everybody. Whether you're just getting into photography and videography or you are a seasoned professional, we want these to be something that is, hopefully beneficial for everybody across the spectrum. Today's particular stream, we are talking about the photo assist tools, or some of them at least. Kind of a follow-up as to last week's stream. We did primarily the video assist tools, which we will put a card on the playback of this video to link to that one. But yeah, really just talking about some of the cool things, explaining where they are in the menus, how you can find them. And like I've done on the previous streams, I pre-recorded this whole session so that the topics and the demonstrations can be really kind of straightforward, get the actual information out there. What that means is that during this broadcast, if you have questions and you want to just kind of ask away, make sure to drop them in the chat, tag at LUMIX Cameras, as you can see a couple people are doing in the chat already, and we'll answer them in text form for the most part. After the session portion that we're going to have about the different tools and demonstrations about them, we'll come back live and then we'll, kind of clean up some of the questions there. Before we jump into that, I want to remind everybody about Lumix Pro Services. We do this every single week. Here in the United States, we have the red and the platinum tier. If you're just getting a Lumix camera or you've already got one and you're looking for, kind of a good service and support program behind it, Lumix Pro Services offers that in a varying different level of kind of coverage options there. Sounds super sales pitchy. But the red tier is free. That one, if you're in the United States, the red tier is completely free. If you bought a camera, get it. It comes with the purchase of the camera. If you want something that's maybe a little bit higher level, that's where our Platinum series comes in. That gets you all the red level benefits, so 3-year extended warranty here in the United States. But the Platinum series gets you things like 20% off out of warranty repairs, 2-day repairs with free next day shipping both ways. You get an exclusive hotline where if you need to speak to somebody about a challenge or an issue or a question you have, you can actually call into our team during normal business hours in the week. And then you also get a welcome kit with it too, which includes a really slick Peak Design slide strap. So if you're in the United States, definitely take a look at the 2 programs we have here in stateside. If you're joining us from outside of the US, we have a link down in the description that will bring you to the global portal where you can see what's available in your particular region. More regions are being added over time. So if you don't see your country there, definitely let your local region know that it's something you're interested in. And then hopefully we can get that rolling in those regions soonish. So with that, let's actually jump right into the topic today, because like I said, it is a bit of a long one, and we've got a fairly good number of tools and assist features to talk about. So let's throw it to past me. So all the Lumix cameras come with a really wide variety of different assist type tools for both photo and video. And on last week's stream, we talked primarily about the 4 major video-oriented assist tools. So waveform, luminance spot meter, the zebras, as well as potentially where you could use the histogram for video kind of exposure adjustments. Well, on the photo side, there are equally a large number available in our different cameras. So I've got my GH6 hooked up here, since it kind of represents the widest range of what's available in both photo and video, but also gives me some just flexibility in showing off some of these different things over HDMI. So to jump right into this, let's look at the I.S Status Scope. So we'll look where it is in the menu, and let's talk about actually what it does. So I.S Status Scope is a feature that was released on the S-series cameras when we first released the S1 and S1R. What this mode does, and you find it by going into the camera's custom settings menu. So one little trick here, if you're in these menus and you want to figure out which menu is what, if you push the display button, you'll get a more detailed kind of definition of what mode you're in. So as you can see right now, we're in the cog menu, which is the custom menu. We're going to go down to monitor, display, and then for photo. So this will be page 2 on the GH6. Other cameras, you'll see monitor, display, parentheses, photo, and that's the one that you know that you want to be in. So here, you'll see that we've got I.S Status Scope. So this is where you find it. And for those that are used to looking at the Lumix line of cameras, you'll see that there are, right now on camera, I've got my level, my manual focus box, meters, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of busy, but this would be like kind of the normal display that you're looking through. Well, if you are a photographer and you're doing more handheld style shooting, up until now, the only kind of gauge that you would have for, you know, is my camera level, like those are the tools that you have, is just to be able to tell you that the camera's level, you know, if you're at an angle, if you're pointed up, if you're vertical, and you never really had a clear indicator of, well, how much shake am I putting into this image? That's what I.S Status Scope was built to kind of help with. So when I turn this on, you'll see that now you get 2 concentric circles, as well as a crosshair in the middle and a little green dot. This, when you're not using it, when you're not actually half pressing the shutter, it's just going to have that dot dead center, and it doesn't move. But when you half press the shutter and you start to move the camera a little bit, you'll see how that dot now kind of moves around in the frame. Now, what this is showing me is from the moment I half press the shutter, I want to make sure and have that dot as dead centered into the frame as I possibly can. And what that's telling me is that the image and the stabilization system are basically perfectly level. There's no shake, there's no vibration being added into the image. As that ball starts to move around in the frame while you're half pressing the shutter, that's giving you a visual representation of how much the sensor is having to actually move to compensate for the motion that you've got. Now, why are there 2 circles? Well, basically the way this is set up is that if you want to have as sharp of an image as you can, you want to train yourself to be able to hold the camera, breathe in a certain way, and just kind of stabilize yourself in a certain way so that that little ball stays as close to that inner gray crosshair, which is my center markers that I have there. This is going to indicate that you're going to get about as stable of a shot as you possibly can with the system. Now, on different cameras, that's going to equate to different levels of stabilization, right? On the S-series cameras, like S1, S1R, S1H, we have 7.5 stops. When you go to cameras like the GH6, that's 7.5 stops also. But when you go to cameras like the GH5 Mark II or an S5, that's where you're looking at closer to 5.5 to 6 stops, right around those ranges. And something to remember is that those measurements are done by SEPA. So those are like an industry benchmark test for stabilization. Every user is going to have a little bit of a different variance in what you're able to actually achieve in the stabilization. And with I.S Status Scope, this can help you visualize the breathing that you may be imparting into your images when you're trying to do longer exposure shots. This can also help judge, you know, are you someone who holds a camera like this, where you've got your hand over the lens, which this is not a good way to hold the camera. You want to kind of more cradle it in your hands from a more photography perspective. Now, clearly, these are not 100% that's the way you need to shoot with a camera. That's not what I'm saying at all. But basics in stability is that this is going to get you more stable than this, because your arm's going to get tired and pull the front of the lens down, and then you're fighting it, and then you're going to constantly be moving the camera. The other thing that I.S Status Scope is designed to also help you with is not just your hand position on the camera, but also remembering that because we've moved to having rear LCDs on our cameras that are high quality, that give you live view playback, everything that you'd experience through the viewfinder, we've started to kind of shift the way a lot of people photograph and even create video files with, to where you're holding the camera further away from your body, which can be fine, especially if you've got a rig, things like that. But in photography, a lot of times you find that when you really need to get as much stability as you possibly can, you want to put the camera to your face, because now you have your 3 points of contact, no matter what, whether you're left eye or right eye dominant. And the I.S Status Scope will actually show you how much of a difference this makes. So if you're someone who's looking and you're shooting, longer telephoto lenses, or, you're shooting ultra wide, landscapes, so basically everything in between there as well, and you're finding that you're just not getting as sharp of an image as you would want to, I highly recommend taking a look at the I.S Status Scope and kind of narrowing down where potentially that shake is coming from. Is it a shutter speed that's set maybe a little too slow? Is it just the environment that you're working on? Even if you're someone that's, say, working on a tripod, stabilization, modern stabilization systems really don't have to be turned off while you're on a tripod. They are smart enough now that when there's not enough, like when there's no motion in the camera, the sensor's going to stay stable. Granted, that's true for mechanical stabilization. Electronic stabilization is different because that uses image data. Using I.S Status Scope can also help you understand, is the platform that my tripod on, is it actually stable, or is that platform moving enough that it's actually going to impart, kind of an issue on the sensor? Now, I.S Status Scope activates only when you half press the shutter. So if you're someone that's working on a tripod, you'd probably be using at that point either a cabled release or something that's going to allow you a half press, and that half press will let you actually enable and see the I.S Status Scope working. So that's I.S Status Scope. It's a fairly simple, straightforward tool, and I still was able to go on 10 minutes about it. All right, so the next tool that we're going to look at here in the photography sense is the constant preview. Now, constant preview is available in video modes as well, but there's a couple different changes with constant preview that we've had over the last couple of years of having this mode available on different cameras. So we're still on my GH6 here, and we're going to use this as a demonstration. First off, you can find constant preview by going into the settings, or the custom settings menu. So again, if I hit display, you'll see that this is custom. And then I'm going to go to page 1 of monitor display, and in this case, photo. And then you'll see the option for constant preview. Now, what constant preview does is basically it sets your camera up so that you can be mimicking either your shutter speed and aperture, or just your aperture, depending on the camera that you're using. So because we're on a GH6 right here, I have the option of set under constant preview. So when I go into set, you'll see that I have the ability to say constant preview while using MF assist. So whenever you're using the manual focus assist, which is the punch in, you can still have this enabled. But under effect, you'll see that I have 3 different modes, and each one is designed to tell you how does the system work when you're in either aperture or when you're in manual mode. Now, one of the kind of criticisms of constant preview for some users is that in older cameras that we have, your shutter speed and aperture are both simulated for the constant preview, because it's designed to basically show you what is your image going to look like when you take it. Now, for general shooting, broad daylight shooting, that doesn't sound like a problem. Sure, mimic my shutter speed. If the image is going to look a little staccato, awesome. Whatever the depth of field is going to look like, that's great. But when you start getting into lower light scenarios, or if you're shooting where you really want dynamic lighting and you're trying to do something where you're dragging the shutter, it's not as great, because now what happens is your display is updating basically every exposure that you're making. So if you have a 1 second exposure, your display is going to be updating every 1 second with the actual image that would be captured in that 1 second. So for certain cases, incredibly useful and really valuable. But in the newer cameras, what most people seemed to have really wanted with a constant-ish preview is, one, you want to be able to see what your depth of field is going to change to, which is a nice advantage. So if you're trying to actively figure out, do I want to shoot this at 1.8? Do I want to shoot this at f4? You want to have a good visual representation of what your bokeh, what your background is going to look like. But also, you want to be able to have it where you actually see the image get darker or brighter. So you want it closer to the ideal what you see is what you get of an image. And there are different methodologies for doing this and different logics for it. This is our logic, and that's just how we've been doing it. So what you'll see is that I have the ability here, and my preferred way is to actually just use the aperture for constant preview. So that I know where my depth of field is, since that's primarily what I'm looking for. So you can set it for aperture mode is going to stop your aperture down for you. Manual mode will only be aperture. Or you can mix this where aperture does show you the aperture, but manual mode shows you aperture and shutter speed, as you see here. Or no effect in aperture mode and only have it effective in full manual. So couple different options available here. Each one, if you're someone looking into this, play around with each one of these. If you're someone who's always been a little frustrated with the shutter speed kind of simulation that happens with constant preview, and your camera has this, I recommend coming in and changing this to aperture and aperture. So what this allows me to do is, if I come in here and let's turn constant preview on. Well, right now you can see that I am set at f8 for my image. And let's say I want to take this memory card and I want to focus specifically on this, right? So we're going to come here, we're going to focus right on that memory card, and I'm at f8, so I can see what my bokeh is going to look like. But I kind of want this to be really, really shallow. So let's go all the way to f1.7. I can actually visualize how this is going to be changing in the image. By default, now if I turn this off, so if I turn constant preview off, you'll see that it's fully shallow depth of field. And as I change my aperture, even if I get all the way up to, let's go all the way down to like f11 or f16 in this case, nothing changed. So it's not actually giving you a representation of what your image is going to look like. Yes, you have your exposure meter. It's telling me that this image is going to be underexposed by a stop and a third. So, even if I come in here and I change this to the proper exposure, I have no indication of what this image is going to look like. When I turn this on, it stops down. I have an indication now of what my depth of field is going to look like. But I don't have that shutter speed effect, right? So that was one of the things that we turned off. Well, if I go into the menu and go to set, go to effect, and since I'm in, it's not actually going to matter because I'm in full manual, I'm going to set this to aperture and shutter speed effect. So now you'll see the lag in the frame there. So what this is telling me is that this image is a 3.2 of a second. So we're not fully down at 1 second. If I get all the way down to 1 second here and I start to move this, you see what your shutter speed effect's going to do. So it would show you what your light trails are going to look like. Well, if I start to bring this up to a higher range here, this is where I can also start to get and see, well, what's going to be happening to my exposure overall. Am I going to be really, really dark? What is this actually going to look like? So if you're someone who likes to use the image and actually view it on screen to kind of judge what your exposure is going to be instead of just using the meters, or you want to have a better idea of what the meters are doing, and as long as you're in good light, And by that, I mean you're not basically going below like 24th or 25th of a second. This is where I can come in and say, okay, well, the meter's telling me that this is a proper exposure, but those shadow regions are really dark and I want it brighter. So I'm going to lower my shutter speed here, bring this up a little bit. That chip chart, the gray card's, out of focus, so I'm fine with it being a little more blown out. I want a little more depth of field in this image, so let's stop that down. Let's bring this exposure up a bit. I like that image much better. Cool, let's take it. So that's your constant preview. It has a lot of flexibility depending on the camera that you're in. And if you're someone who has some issues with shooting much slower shutter speeds, so I typically, like I said, if you're at about 20th of a second, you're okay. When you start going slower than 20th of a second is where you're really going to start noticing that blur start to show up. And then when you get down, really, really down into these shutter speeds, this is where you start to really, show what that blur is. And just remember, that's by design because you're previewing what your actual full-blown exposure is at that point. So now that we have that done, let's take a look at kind of one of the next ones, which is Live View Boost. This is the alternative that you can use for constant preview if you're someone that shoots and captures in really low light scenarios. So, like we said, constant preview designed to give you an exposure preview of your image, but there are certain times where you are photographing or creating video in really low light, primarily photography, not as much videography, but you are shooting in such an environment that you're either having to use things like lights to be able to help you even do something as simple as focus, because you are, say, astrophotography, or you're night sky photography, and you're out in the middle of nowhere in a dark skies location. Really hard to find out where you're going to focus when even cameras that boast really, really good low light autofocus or really low EV autofocus, when it's pitch blackout, it's nearly impossible for any system to actually be able to autofocus and assist you. Well, we built in a mode here called Live View Boost into our cameras. Now, there are two levels of this, and this is really not going to help you in everyday shooting, so just want to make that clear. This is not really a mode that you're going to use every day, all the time. This is going to help you in really, really low light scenarios for shooting. So when you come in here, you'll see that you've got a couple different options. You have mode 1 and mode 2. Now, the difference between these modes is how much the frame rate on the back of the LCD, so the refresh rate of your live view preview, how much that drops. So mode 1 means that your image is going to be displayed much brighter, but you're going to have a little bit of a loss in the actual viewfinder or the EVF refresh rate, so it'll look a little choppier. Then there's mode 2, which is really going to boost up the gain on the previewed image, but you're going to have a pretty substantial drop in the actual refresh rate. Now, why does this kind of make sense? We were just talking about in low light, you don't want the shutter speed to be lagging the image, right? Well, this is a little different. With the constant preview, every frame is updating at the cycle that your shutter speed's at. So in normal shooting, sure, that can be okay. But if you're, photographing a night sky or a long exposure and you've got a 10-second exposure, that's not good. That means that image is updating every 10 seconds and you're going to have 10 seconds worth of blur, which means previewing an image before you actually capture it's not really as useful. Well, when you switch into this mode, you're not actually using the shutter speed for judging or brightening the image up. This is using processing to basically just boost the gain levels in the camera and a mix of refresh rate and, kind of display rate that the camera's using. I think is an easy way to explain it. So here, the image is choppy not because the shutter speed's choppy. The refresh rate's choppy because of how much amplification it's throwing into that previewed side of the image so that you can use tools like your focus peaking. You can use tools like punch in And to some extent, we do have some autofocus features in here that really do help if you're someone that's photographing, say, like stars. So there are some benefits there as well. But ultimately, this is just a tool for ultra low light shooting where you're not concerned about previewing exactly what the image is going to look like, because that would be a 20-second exposure, 10-second exposure. But you want to be able to still use tools like your manual focus, your peaking, stuff like that. This just boosts the display preview for it. But we also have this set option here. So this allows me to come in and say, like, okay, I only want Live View Boost to work when I'm in full manual, or you want it to work in the full PASM options here. So you get to pick which one you want. Most of the time, people tend to leave this in manual, and usually I'd recommend it. If you're someone that jumps back and forth between, say, photographing a dark wedding reception or something along those lines, you probably don't want this in PASRM in all of the ranges, because if you're jumping between, say, Aperture and then manual, that means that if the light level gets low enough, your display may start to kind of forcibly brighten itself in an area where it might not really be necessary for you. Leaving it in full manual, since a number of users nowadays don't really shoot full manual all the time, especially in a more fast-paced environment, this can help it at least kind of change out when it is that you're going to use it. Landscape photography, since like I said, it's kind of one of my more primary things that I like to shoot these days. Landscape photography, this thing's great. I leave it on for manual, and it does pretty much every little thing that I need it to do for low light shooting. Now, one bonus thing for this is for the astro and night sky photographers. So Live View Boost mode, great. You can actually see the image. You get a good idea of where your manual focus is going to go. Awesome, right? Well, if you've ever gone out really late at night for photography or doing some, like, Milky Way shooting, stuff like that, you'll also realize that because it's ultra low light, the camera has a hard time of actually being able to make out anything in the darkness of a landscape. Well, so do your eyes. And one of the things that we've built in on the LUMIX cameras is what's called night mode on a lot of our cameras. And we have two options for it. You have night mode in the monitor as well as on the LVF, or the live viewfinder, or EVF, interchangeable terminology. So, but this allows you to actually come in and make a ton of adjustments for both the monitor and the viewfinder to just literally set them up as a red frame. So if we take a look at my GH6 here, you'll see that right now I've got this set up on night mode here for my monitor. And as I change this back and forth, if I come back into that menu, instead of clicking out of it, you have full color, and then we've got night mode, full color, night mode. So this is a really cool option for anyone that's actually going to go out and photograph at night, and you want to be able to actually see what it is you're doing. You don't realize how bright your rear LCDs or your EVFs are until you're actually out in a really dark environment. Now, yes, these don't help you judge your exposure, and we are talking about, primarily exposure assist tools. But these typically go hand in hand with the live view boost option, so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned it here as well. All right, so one of the next tools that is found in this camera for assisting different styles of photography is called Shear Overlay. Now, Shear Overlay is designed for, say, like product photography, or anyone where you're creating images and you know that you have to leave either certain space for, say, ad copy, or you're someone who likes to work on composite images and you want to be able to always have a reference as to where either your previous image was or what your kind of setup should be for that next, kind of shot. Now, for this particular style of shooting here, we're going to adjust my image here so that this is technically, we're going to overexpose this a bit. So we're 2 stops overexposed. So say I am photographing this this Samsung T5 drive, right? And I want to be able to photograph this and know that, okay, hey, this region I need to leave open for the next product. Because I want to have consistency across the board. And we're thinking about this as if I'm doing, say, kind of like advertising photography or product photography. So to start with, we've got the Samsung T5 drive right here. I've got it kind of framed up where I want it. I want it in like the rule of thirds because, you know, eye and composition and whatnot. So to start with, I'm going to take that first image. So we got that image and we're going to go back, play back this image. Cool, not the greatest photo, not the point of this, but it looks great. So what Shear Overlay allows me to do is come in here, go into the custom menu, go into monitor display photo page 2, and then go into Shear Overlay and click set. Now I have a couple of options here for this. I have the transparency of the previous image, so low or high. High transparency means that it's going to be very faint, so it's not really going to be impacting the image. Really just a light kind of what's called like an onion skin on the frame. Low means that it's going to come through a lot higher. Its opacity is not going to be as, or its opacity is going to be not as great, so it's going to look more stark against the background. You have the ability to set this so that when you power cycle the camera, the Shear Overlay turns off. And then you also have the displayed image when you shutter press. So what this means is it will preview while you don't have the shutter pressed where that Shear Overlay is. And then once you have pressed the shutter, you have the choice to either have it turn Shear Overlay off or leave it on. I typically leave it on because that's just usually how I'm working with this. But the important thing here is the image select. So I'm going to click on image select and you'll see this opens up the menu so where I can look at the different images that I've captured here and then I can pick the one that I want to use for this particular demonstration. And we're going to use that one that I just created. So when I click menu set on this option, that image is now set. That's in the Shear Overlay. And when I come back, Shear Overlay is on. Now when I half press the shutter, you'll see that I now have a kind of ghosted image of that reference photo in the frame. So things like the T5 drive, you'll see it here. It's a little, hopefully this is coming across relatively easy for the viewing that you have here. So for me now, this means that if I want to have something that is either framed the same or I know that I need to have, say, this region as like kind of a safety region because this is where, say, text is going to go for an advertisement, I know that I can move this other frame or this second image basically anywhere I want in the overall image to figure out, okay, hey, this is going to be the safe region. Or if I'm trying to composite images, I can come in here and say, okay, I want to put the next T5 drive there, and I want to have this come in and I want to focus on that. And then now I want to half press, take my photo. Now when I review this image, you'll see there's the one, there's the original one, and I have both of these images now to where they're not going to overlap. So if I'm going to be doing a composite of these images, I know that one, they're not going to overlap, so I'm not going to have to change anything in the background. It's going to be fine. But also, I know that I've got the ability to kind of keep a safety region for this. Now, I'm demoing this with product photography because it seems to be one of the easiest ways to actually kind of show it off. But ultimately, this can be used for pretty much anything, right? You could be a portrait photographer and you know that you have a certain style of, say, a background that you're going to be compositing your subject onto. So say you're photographing on green screen, right? Or you're going to be doing anything where you know you have to pull that background out. This allows me to say, I know what this background image is going to be. Green screen's probably a good example, probably one of the best examples of this. I know that I'm going to be overlaying this image as my background, and it's a photo that I've taken with this camera, and say I'm a wedding portrait photographer, or just a studio portrait photographer, and I know that the subject wants, or the model or the client wants me to superimpose them into a known background. I can have that image loaded in as the Shear Overlay, and then I can know visually now where I want to have my frame made, where I want that actual photo to be made, so that when I drop it onto that background and I key out the background that I don't want with the main photo, I know how it's going to look already. I know that, say I've got this beautiful landscape or it's under a tree and, you know, you're kind of having to composite the image for whatever reason. I know that if I have my horizontal framing this way and the background's here and say the tree is like right here, I know that I can place my subject here and know that, one, I'm not going to have a tree growing out of their head in the photo. I don't have to spend as much time in post manipulating the image left and right to kind of figure out where I want them. It gives a much more natural appearance to that final end goal composite image that you typically didn't really have as much flexibility in the past. You really had to either mask this out yourself, or you were doing a ton of work in post to manually move subjects around, and then perspective may not look 100% right, things like that. Now, a little bit of a tidbit, Shear Overlay actually is a feature that is grown from some of the other functionality that we have in our Lumix cameras. So one of those is called stop motion animation, and it's built right in with the time-lapse mode, which is a dial accessed option on a number of our cameras. So if you were looking to do stop motion and you wanted to do this in maybe a little more automatic of an option, this is where you could use this. Or you could use Shear Overlay as a standard photographer and do things like stop motion fully manually with it. But what you would do is if you set the camera into the time-lapse mode, click the menu button, it's going to bring you right to that time-lapse animation option. When you click on this, the mode is where by default it sets a time-lapse shot, but I can go into stop motion animation, and then I can do auto shooting on or off. And then from here, so say I'm in this particular image, so say I have this drive up, right? So we're going to have this drive here. Let's move my focus box over here. And typically for stop motion, you're going to do this in manual focus. You're not going to want to autofocus because you want to make sure that everything is as isolated as possible. So the first shot, we'll take this image. The next shot, you'll see it already did that overlay. I can then move this. You see a little bit of that onion skin there. I can take my next image. And then I have the ability to keep moving this. And this overlays a couple of different images together so that as I'm moving this, I have that kind of reference point. Now, what it means is that when I go into post and I start looking at this, I can then come through and say, hey, I want to look at this and I want to see how that's going to move. I have all the movement here and we're pretty good. So this is one of the ways that you can make like a GIF or a GIF, depending on, you know, how you want to pronounce that. You have the options to actually kind of make this. Now you can, again, like I said, you can use Shear Overlay and do this fully manually if you want, and it works perfectly fine. But it's derived from the actual stop motion mode that's actually built into our cameras. All right, the last thing that we're going to talk about is the different aspect ratios. And the reason we're going to talk about aspect ratios is that while, yes, I think a lot of people understand what aspect ratios are. I mean, they're not as complicated as some of the other different options in the camera. There's a different way that we handle aspect ratios with a vast number of our cameras with very few exceptions, and I'll call those out. And that's if you're someone who likes to shoot, you know, RAW and JPEG images, but you want to actually start utilizing different framing options. So 1:1, 4:3 if you're in full frame, or 3:2 if you're in the 4/3 sensor. You have the option in our cameras to actually just change the aspect ratio and view the images in that ratio, capture them, and then work with them in post in those aspect ratios. Right now, I have my S5 hooked up for this because it gives me more aspect ratios than the other cameras. But the same is going to be true for all the cameras that we have and the aspect ratios that you want to work in. So to start with, you can see here that we are in a 3:2 aspect ratio. So this is the full 35mm censored aspect ratio. Pretty straightforward. It's what we normally would think of if we're shooting in full frame. If I'm in micro 4/3, this will be in a 4:3 aspect ratio. So if I hit the quick menu button here, you'll see that I have my aspect ratio options available. Everything from 4:3 to 3:2, which is the normal, 16:9, 1:1. And then on the full frame cameras, we have 2 additional options that have raised some questions in different forms. It's like, well, when would I use this? How does it work? What does it do? And that would be 65:24 and 2:1. So to start with, give a little bit of an explanation for these. So 4:3 is going to be very close to your 8:10 framing. So if you're making 8:10 prints or your output's going to be 8:10, cool, you've got it. You know what the cropped regions are going to be. 3:2, again, full frame, 35mm sensor. That's the full sensor width and height. Same goes for 4:3 as being full sensor height and width when you're in micro four thirds. Then you have your 16:9. So 16:9, if you're going to be actually photographing for a 16:9 display, this can be incredibly useful. You know how the image is going to look for that particular output. Same with 1:1. You know, the very traditional square format. And for a little history lesson for a lot of the younger viewers, 1:1 was very popular with like Hasselblad medium format cameras, so 2 1/4 cameras. So you'd have a square frame and then you'd crop out the images if you were making 4:6s, 5:7s, things like that. But we still carry it because it's a very useful and it's a very kind of iconic aspect ratio from photography history. It just so happens that it works really well on things like Instagram. But then there's this 65:24 and then this 2:1. Ratio is changing its display on the camera. So I am seeing what the image is going to look like when I actually capture it. So if we look at my 3:2 aspect ratio here, right? I've got the Samsung T5 drive. It's right front and center. We're focused on it. Cool. If I take this picture and then go into playback, cool. I see a 3:2 aspect ratio image. I'm shooting in RAW, so it tells me I'm shooting in RAW. Cool. I have that full image there. Well, if I come in here and say, I'm going to go to the most stark difference one here, which is the 65:24. And for those that don't know, 65:24 is basically a double width aspect ratio for 35mm SLR style shooting. So it's 24 high by 65 wide. This came about actually kind of historically, so a little history lesson for everybody. This came about kind of back with like the Hasselblad X-Pan, and I forget what the Fujifilm's version of the X-Pan one was as well. And what that camera did is it actually was a panoramic camera. It would take, instead of an individual full frame 35mm image, it would actually take 2 side by side, and that was your panoramic image. We've basically taken modern cameras, since we can cut any aspect ratio you want out of these, and we've given you the same kind of aspect ratio. Now, yeah, it's coming from a singular image, but resolution's really high, so you still get a really nice solid looking image out of it. But enough of the history lesson. So as you can see here, you lose your height out of this image, but you're getting the full width of that 35mm sensor for photography. And this can be incredibly awesome for landscape type shooting. If you're doing, like back in November, I went to the Grand Canyon on a road trip and was taking a lot of kind of more expansive shots with the 16-35 in my IR converted S1R, which is up on the shelf back there, in this 65:24, because aesthetically I love that panoramic look for things like landscape. Well, the beautiful thing about the way we handle aspect ratios is that if I'm shooting RAW and JPEG, my JPEGs will come out in this aspect ratio. So when I open them up, they're already going to be cropped in and, you know, kind of cut up to this particular resolution. But if you're someone who likes to go back and edit your photos, that can pose a problem, right? You create this image in this 65:24, this relatively constricted aspect ratio for wide landscape, but then, you know, you're thinking back on it and you want to make an 8:10 out of it, or you want to have something that's got all the height that was in that image. Well, in most cameras, you're kind of stuck with whatever aspect ratio you shot it at for that image. With our cameras, if I take this exact same photo, so same thing, did not move it at all. If I take this image, because I have my camera set in RAW, when I go into playback, you'll see that you still get that full 3:2 aspect ratio image, but I have the grayed out kind of masked area that the 65:24 is not capturing for a JPEG image. So what does this actually mean? So what this means is that, say I were to take this photo and I bring it into post and I'm like, oh, I'm looking at this and I really wish that that full Samsung, T5 drives logo was fully in the frame. I didn't really like that it ended up cropping out the bottom portion of that logo. Well, what it means is when I bring this photo into programs like Lightroom or Photoshop or any kind of raw editor, the crop is actually not a hard crop. It's a softwared crop. What that means is when I go into Lightroom and I click on the crop icon, it's going to pull up exactly what you see here. The full 3:2 aspect ratio image with a kind of flag for where that 65:24 crop was for this. So now I can go into post and I can slide that frame up and down and reposition where the crop is on it and know that I didn't lose all of that information to begin with. And this works for all of the different aspect ratios. So if I go to 2:1, which is an incredibly common aspect ratio for mobile devices, maybe not so much on, say, like my S22 Ultra, but on my 13 Pro Max, it's a fairly close aspect ratio, fairly close. Now, I'm not saying that they're identical, but they're fairly close. So this means that I can select 2:1, do the same thing. If I come in here and even do something like 1:1, when I capture this image and go back into post, I can actually now see how much more I have available for me in post to actually edit those images. You get a ton of flexibility with this, and if you're someone, like I said before, and I know I'm reiterating myself with this, but if you're someone who likes to go back and re-edit photos and, maybe, hey, I want to use it for this output, our aspect ratios are definitely a tool in our camera that I think a lot of people may overlook, because now we know that, just like in the videography side, vertical video is becoming such a big, heavy portion of what a lot of people are having to deliver to customers and clients. That, like, if you're working on a project and the client's always going to be asking for square content to be out, delivered out, you have two ways that you can do it in these cameras now. You've got your actual aspect ratios, which is the traditional way, and when you photograph it, you know what it's going to look like. That is how the image is going to come out. When I bring it into software, it's already pre-flagged to be in these crop modes as your previews are built. And I don't necessarily have to rely on using something like the frame markers, which can also be used in photos. So I can come in here and say, hey, I want to go to that 1:1 aspect ratio, and I have it show there. So actually I have to turn them on. So there's my 1:1 ratio. It doesn't look like much because I'm shooting in 1:1, but if I come into 3:2, I have that exact same experience now. So I can either shoot it in the aspect ratio, which means that in post, I'm going to have one less step to do as far as cropping, or I can use things like frame markers for this particular style of shooting. Now, for the videographers out there that may be doing like set photos and you kind of want to pre-visualize what your image is going to look like, you have two options there as well. You can still use frame markers for this. So I can come in here and say I'm doing a 2:3:9:1 aspect ratio for a particular project that I'm working on. I can have it set up so that I can see what is that, if I take a photo, and I'm framing it, using it as kind of a director's finder, what is it going to look like? Or if you're shooting in, say, the 2:1 aspect ratio, which would be 2.0:1, hey, that's my 2.0:1, or I can just click on the actual aspect ratios and come into 2:1 also. Since 2:1 is also a very useful video aspect ratio for things like Netflix and stuff like that. Like I said, it's very close to mobile devices, so it's going to display properly horizontal. And also, I believe 2:1 is the largest width and height that you can just natively do in, say, things like Instagram. So tons of flexibility, lots of cool tools with these different options here. And even while you're shooting in these different aspect ratios, I can come in and I can also still change these frame markers. So if I want to be shooting in 2:1, but I want to see what, you know, a 2:3:9:1 is going to look like, I can throw it on there, even though it's not an aspect ratio that's commonly captured for photography. It gives me that idea of what framing will look like, so that when I bring this, I capture this image, I go into playback, I have that 2:1 ratio, I see what's cropped out of it, I bring it into post, I edit it, I'm good to go. It saves me a ton of time when I'm actually kind of creating this content. So that's kind of like a brief overview of a lot of the, you know, kind of photo tools that are specific in this camera. A lot of them, like I said, they can be used in video as well. It's really just more what they were initially designed for. I think it's amazing what you can use in these different products to kind of help, you know, get your creative vision across. So with that, let's jump back to me in the future and let's answer some questions. So yeah, whole lots of stuff to kind of like talk about with the different video assist, you know, or photo assist tools. Sorry, video assist tools was last week's. And yeah, as a lot of people have pointed out, you know, kind of in the chat, you know, hopefully there was something that you were able to find new or get, you know, a positive takeaway from these different modes. I think actually kind of experimenting and playing around with these different options that are available can really show some areas that, you know, for say the I.S Status Scope, showing how much more stable you can actually be in the different kind of hand-holding positions with a quick just kind of overlay being thrown on the camera. And one of the nice things with most of these features, so it's not all of them, but the vast majority of these different features, is that you can program them so that they are easily accessible from one of your custom function buttons. So you're able to, like, in my case, typically the way I have my camera set up is like my right arrow may be like waveform, so I can turn that on and off. I can set one of my custom function buttons to be I.S Status Scope. Same kind of principle. Turn it on when I need it, turn it off when I want a cleaner looking display. So hopefully you guys play around with some of these things and you know, maybe experience how they can actually help us create some better content in the future, or maybe not even just better content, just make your editing in the post side of photography a little bit easier, a little more straightforward, and a little less time having to sit behind the computer to do some editing and more time actually out in the field shooting and capturing. So I want to run through and see if there were any questions that I kind of missed or didn't get to. We still have a little bit of time left for today's stream, so if you have more questions, definitely drop them in the chat, and we're going to get through them. So let's see here. K Green says, on the GH6, will the following features be added via firmware update? 6K, 4K photo mode, focus stacking, post-focus. I'm on a GH6 and would love to have these features included. So, unfortunately, I don't have information as far as whether or not features can or will be added into the GH6. We did talk when we launched the GH6 over a couple of videos about the 4K, 6K photo mode. It's definitely not really surprising, but it's nice to see that the feature that for the longest time has gone very low under the radar, and from the, you know, kind of studies we've done and the conversations we've had with different content creators, so photographers, videographers, it's nice to see that there's a lot of people that still really loved those features. So it helps us determine whether or not that's a feature that would come back, or if it does come back, does it come back in maybe a more evolved version? So yeah, as far as whether or not they're going to be added there, I kind of just don't have an answer. I'd love to be able to tell you one way or another, but I just don't have an answer for you. Let's see here. Some of the other questions or comments. I gotta watch some of the past ones and play catch up. After July 5th, I'm going to be shooting Prores Raw on the GH6. Yeah, the Prores Raw option on the GH6 is definitely a lot of fun to shoot with. Definitely keep in mind that our approach to RAW from day one has always been be the closest to the actual pixels that you're recording. So it is the actual resolution, so 4096 by 2160 if you're in 4K. If you want the full sensor height, or actually if you want full sensor width, that's where you go to like 5.7K on those cameras. Let's see here, some of the other comments. Just to clarify for others, Alan had asked, can Shear Overlay be used with video too? So unfortunately, the Shear Overlay functionality really only works in the photography mode. There's a lot of processing that ends up having to get done when it's in the video side. So certain features, they're cool, and we'll definitely ask to see if it's something that, maybe they can get added to the different modes. But obviously, in some cases, you may also just run into, like, it's a ton of processing, and it just might not be possible. Let's see here. I think there were some other comments or questions that came up. Let's see here. Nothing on that one. Yeah, okay. So, so across the board, the vast majority of the cameras that we have are going to have a number of these features. If, like I said at the beginning, if you're looking through your camera and you're not seeing specifically the pages or the menu layout that I was showing here, just know that our nomenclature that we use in each of our cameras is pretty much the same across the board. So it may not be in the exact, kind of same menu page or exact same location, because as time evolves, we refine certain parts of that. But the nomenclature will be the same, and you should be able to find it. If you want to hear more about some of those different features, like it seemed that there was definitely some interest in things like the stop motion effect option that we have in the cameras. Definitely let us know in the chat, because that's the kind of stuff that helps us, kind of create the next live streams or create the next set of content that we're going to be producing and posting up on this channel. This whole platform is designed by your commentary. So if there are things that you want to learn or things that you want us to dive deeper into, let us know in the chat, let us know in the comments. It helps us build this stuff, and we get the content that you're actually looking for across the board. Let's see here. Tommy says, since I have a G95 that I take with me backpacking and moto camping, I was curious if the G9's Venus processor was powerful enough to do 80 megapixel high res or 100 megapixel like on the GH6. So for the G95, it's really actually a combination of a couple of things. The Venus engine that's used in the G95 is one of the older ones, or older. Everything's older now compared to what we're using in the GH6. And because of that, that's one piece of it. The other thing is the higher precision gyros needed for the stabilization unit. So cameras like the G95, the G85, GX series, they're not going to get high-res mode. It is a hardware limitation for the newer equipment. Probably not the greatest answer you wanted, but that's just kind of how those systems work. Where was the other one? Epic had asked, are there any sales on the GH6 coming up? Not that I know of. The GH6 still being very new and still basically selling as one of our better selling cameras that we've had, if not best selling camera. You're probably not going to see many deals or price promotions on a camera like that. We did just get done with, was it Prime Day and a round of promotions. So there are promotions running, just usually not on the newest camera because, supply, things like that. It's harder to keep them in stock, and yeah, it's just kind of how that stuff goes. Let's see here. So that looks like we've got through pretty much all the questions for this one, which I'm kind of not surprised with the photo-oriented streams. We typically tend to not necessarily have as many questions get asked because it's usually fairly straightforward. So one of the things that we mentioned about last week was one of the side things about the Lumix Live platform is that we wanted to offer a platform for users to also kind of, share your content and let others know, you know, what kind of stuff you're making. So if anybody feels like it, feel free to drop your Instagram handles or your Twitter handles, social media handles down into the chat. Caveat being that the YouTube ones, because they're YouTube links, they usually get flagged in the chat. Because, you know, we want to build this community. We want to be able to highlight, you know, other creators out there. If you've got some really cool projects or really cool content that you're super excited about or super proud of, let us know. Show us in all those different platforms, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, on here on Lumix Live. It's so cool to just see the kind of content that everyone else makes. And, you know, hopefully, or maybe someone else in the chat is looking for inspiration and they see it in some of your work. Here, we just had a couple of other questions come in here. Jake says, would love to get my hands on a Panasonic TV to be used as a reference monitor here in the States. Pass it to your engineers. Yeah. Unfortunately, we just don't sell TVs here in the United States. We do sell them in Canada, though. Let's see here. FC says, is there a trick for using constant preview function when it is assigned to a custom button? I was not able to get it to work with a custom button. I have to look into that. I rarely ever am playing around with constant preview, like turning it on and off. It's just always on with just the aperture options for mine. So I'll play around with the custom functions and see if see how it works in there. Even though I work with these cameras day in and day out, I know a vast majority about them, but I don't always know every little thing about them. So sometimes I will have to check in on them. Tommy says, no problem. I understand the hardware limitations. I was just trying to avoid taking the GH6 on the bike. I'm scared enough taking the G95. You know, ironically, the GH6 is probably, actually probably not probably, it is better weather resistant than the G95. So, your GH6 would probably take a lot more abuse than the G95 will. Not saying that the G95 can't take abuse out in the field. I ride with my cameras sitting, you know, right in my saddlebag on my motorcycle all the time, and yeah, they've been perfectly fine. Especially down here in Austin, where it's like 106 degrees or 103 or whatever it is today. 101 right now, at least according to my thermometer over here. Let's see here. Let's see here. This was a must. We'll definitely review like 2 more times to catch up. Yeah. Awesome. Within about an hour, we'll have the actual chapters set up on the video. I'm getting back into actually being able to, you know, set the chapters properly on these videos. I missed a number of them. So in a little bit of time, you'll have the chapter set up for each of the tools that you want to take a look at. Okay, and FC, you were talking about for strobes. Okay, yeah. So strobes, I know that there are some challenges with strobes in constant preview. I do have to dig more into that. I haven't really ever gone too deep into how that system works with constant preview. So yeah, I'll have to take a look, and then I'll check with my engineers to validate anything I say before I move forward. And then Sacred says, you got to do another outdoor stream. Texas is like 103 degrees. Yes. Actually, that was the plan for today, but it being about 101 to 106 degrees, I can do it, but I like the last one I did, I ended up actually kind of overheating before anything else did. So we will be doing another out in the field general AMA session, depending on how the weather holds up down here in a couple of the locations that I like to do these streams in. So we'll post the schedule as soon as I have it, and hopefully the weather and everything kind of holds out for that. So yeah, with that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something, you know, useful about some of the different photo assist tools. There's so many more tools in these cameras as well. If this is a topic that you really liked, or this general kind of conversation, definitely let us know in the comments after this video. If you have more questions after this video after this stream is done, drop them in the comments. We try to get through questions that get posted in the comments as often as we can. So definitely drop it in there. We're huge, you know, super happy to address questions at any time, whether or not we're live or not. If you felt that this content was really useful, you learned something, I would love it if we deserved a like and a subscribe from you. It helps me grow this channel. It helps us bring out new content. And yeah, it's just super fun to keep doing these. If you haven't already, check us out over on Instagram. We're Lumix USA over on Instagram. We do also have our TikTok channel open, so if you're someone who likes to just pass the time, you know, browsing through TikTok and stuff like that, we have some more funny content over there and some useful content for how to use these cameras and little kind of like feature segments over there. So definitely go take a look at that. We will be back live next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Like I said, we may actually be out in the field with a general AMA. Not 100% sure. Got to really take a look at that, the temperatures and stuff. But yeah, with that, thank you, everybody. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day and a great weekend. And again, if you shoot some cool stuff and you're super proud of it, let us know. Show us with the different hashtags we've got and tag us on all your social platforms because we'd love to see all of your content posted online. With that, take care. Talk to you next week.